I'm Thorne and I write crime fiction, and the crime fiction that I write is generally defined as psychological crime or domestic noir. I prefer to think of it as crime in time, a lot of time. The standard detective novel begins with a murder or the discovery of a body, and it progresses through a series of evidence, clues, suspects, red herrings, to the climax, which is the revelation of the murderer. The case is closed, the jigsaw is solved, that's it. I don't see crime like that. I don't want to follow it from X to Y to Z. I want to go all the way back to A and discover where it came from. On the 28th of June 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. It made headlines round the world, and we all know what it led to. It was the first of a series of dominoes tipping over until they tipped into the carnage of the First World War. You can't really say, though, that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was the cause of the war. To find the cause, you have to go much further back through the establishment of railway networks into the entire political, economic and social history of all the power blocks in Europe and into the worldwide land grabbing that had been going on since the 15th century. Murder is the same. There may be an initial word or deed that acts as a trigger for it, but its actual causes are further back. A whole series of moments lead to that point, and that is what I prefer to explore. Traditionally, there are three things the detective has to identify in the murderer. He has to have means, could be poison, weapon, a pillow, baseball bat, his bare hands, even a frozen leg of lamb. Louis Mazzini managed to use quite a few methods when he was bumping off his entire family in Kind Hearts and Coronets, and if you're looking for inspiration, I would highly recommend you watching the film. Besides the means, the murderer has to have a motive. Greed or need, hate, love, lust, anger, fear. It has to be something that the prosecution can stand up in court and say, this is the reason why X killed Y. Then there has to be opportunity. There has to be the right time and the right place, and either a very good disguise or a complete lack of audience. I think this trio misses out the most important one, the one thing that a murderer has to have, and that is a willingness, through desperation or internal dissolution or mere psychopathy, to break a taboo that's been drummed into us from birth. We do not kill. It's against the law, yes, but it's also against our instinct. Whether we put it down to upbringing, education, social mores, or God's commandments, we instinctively know that if we could freely kill whenever we wanted, everyone around us could freely kill us. We don't want to live our entire lives with our backs against the wall, watching what other people are doing. So we do not kill. Of course, there are psychopaths out there who just don't care because they're totally immune to taboos. There are deranged serial killers who kill because they get pleasure out of it. There are paid assassins, hitmen. But the majority of murders are committed by ordinary people who probably never dreamed that they would do such a thing. Most murders aren't planned or not rationally planned. They are merely the last fatal result of a whole series of mistakes and wrong decisions. You too could find yourself at the end of a series of mistakes and wrong decisions, tipping over, losing control, and making that fatal mistake that will stain you forever. So could everyone around you. It's a scary thought. It's the series of wrong decisions and mistakes that I really want to examine when I write about crime. I want to go way back into the murderer's past and into the past of the victim. Yes, there are murderers who will murder a complete stranger, but the majority of victims are killed by people they know, people very close to them. Why do they let it happen? Do they suspect that it might happen? Do they live in fear of it? Or do they think it's something that they can control? Or have they just decided to ignore it? Or are they so benumbed by the situation that they can't think of a way to escape from it? I want to examine, weave together all the strands of those past mistakes that lead finally to the unlawful killing of a human being in the Queen's peace with malice aforethought, the definition of murder. In my first novel, A Time for Silence, Sarah Peterson discovers a terrible family secret. Her grandfather, John Owen, was murdered in 1948. The murderer was never caught, so Sarah decides she's going to find out who it was. The story really focuses on the years leading up to the murder of John Owen, as seen through the eyes of his wife, Gwen, from their wedding day in 1933. The truth is interwoven with Sarah's ham-fisted investigations. Ham-fisted because 60 years on, Sarah really can't understand anything about life in the world and the time that she knows nothing about. John Owen was the victim of the murder in A Time for Silence. You could say that the cause of his murder was John Owen himself. Years after I published the book, I was still puzzling over the riddle of John Owen, who he was and why he was what he was. So I wrote The Covenant, which takes the story back to the 1880s with the life of his aunt, Leah, who brought him up. Leah does get a very brief mention in A Time for Silence because her death in 1919 is recorded on the family gravestone. Her story explains his story. How far back would I have to go to explain her story? Well, I could keep going back indefinitely, but enough is enough. I have stopped. In a standard detective novel, the murder is solved, and that probably explains why the genre is so popular. It scares us through the book very pleasurably, but then it reassures us at the end with the knowledge that the murderers never get away with it. In reality, plenty of murderers do. There was an investigation in 2019 which discovered that there were 2,600 murders unsolved in England and Wales. Going further back in time, God knows how many. One of the most famous ones, of course, being from the 1880s with Jack the Ripper in London. Plenty of investigation into his crimes, lots of speculation and theories, and yes, of course, we all want it to have been Queen Victoria's grandson. But the truth is, we don't know who it was. Personally, I'm less interested in Jack the Ripper than in his victims, women who were dismissed as prostitutes. Take the case of the last one, Mary Jane Kelly, or at least the last officially recognised one. If you're interested in genealogy as well as crime, hers is a case you can really get your teeth into, although that is definitely not the right expression to use in this case. We know a huge amount about Mary Jane Kelly from evidence given during her the investigation into her death and the inquest, given by friends, lovers, acquaintances. We know that she was born in Limerick to a very large family, mostly boys. She was 5'7", very pretty, had red hair, a lovely singing voice. Her father was called John, and when she was young, the family moved to Wales, where he worked in the ironworks. She spoke Welsh. She married at 18 a miner called Davis, who was killed a couple of years later in a mining accident. She had a child. Being a destitute widow, she moved to Cardiff to live with her cousin, where she became a prostitute, was admitted to hospital at some time. Then she went on to London, where she lived either in a very high-class brothel or a convent, depending on which story you listen to. She went to France with a client and came back calling herself Marie Jeanette. Finished up as an alcoholic, eviscerated in a dank room in Miller's Court in Whitechapel. We know all this from what was told, and yet there is not a single piece of official evidence marking her life. No birth certificates, marriage certificates, no family details, no prison records, no police records, no hospital records, no census returns. The only official record of her existence is her very gruesome death certificate. Without that, she could have been a fictional character. At least her murder was recognised as officially a murder. So many deaths, murders, have not been recognised as such. How many people have simply disappeared with no record of what became of them? Accident maybe, suicide maybe, new identity maybe, or murder, we don't know. Then there are the deaths which were murders, but we missed it. There must have been plenty of those through history, but you don't have to go that far back to find some. I give you the case of Harold Shipman. He was convicted of murdering 15 of his patients as a result of suspicions that arose in 1998. However, once he was convicted, further investigations suggested that between 1975 and 1998, he actually killed 250 of his patients, and not a single one of those deaths was recognised as murder at the time. Old murders can be hidden away for years and yet still eventually come to light. Should you ever go to Kent, you really ought to visit Moat, a beautiful old house. And if you take the guided tour, they will probably tell you this story. Back in the 1870s, the then owners were annoyed by a draught in one room, so they called in workmen to investigate, and the workmen discovered a secret place behind some panelling, and in the secret place was a skeleton, a woman seated in a chair. Who could she possibly have been? There's no record. Nobody knows who she was. Plenty of speculation, of course. One theory connects her with the gunpowder plot. Another suggests that she was a servant girl who was seduced by the local priest and was walled up to prevent a scandal, which I think is a very clumsy way of preventing a scandal. The truth is, nobody knows who she was, why she was there, when she was put there. The other truth, unfortunately, is that there is no actual evidence that a skeleton was found. It might just have been a juicy myth, but it really ought to have been true. Moat is a very old house going back to the 14th century, which means that it has undoubtedly witnessed a great many deaths, timely and untimely. Any house that predates the National Health Service and our current web of hospitals will have witnessed deaths as well as births. People died at home. Sometimes those deaths were not very pleasant. The house remembers them. In the decaying mansion of Llys in my novel Shadows, the scene is set for a murder that's going to happen. It's building up to it, there's no escaping it, but my protagonist, Kate, just fails to see it coming. She fails because she is busy concentrating on the murders that have happened there in the past. She's been blessed or cursed with an ability to sense the shadows of violent deaths that have imprinted themselves in the fabric of the building, in rocks and dark places. Sure enough, thanks to a lot of restoration work and an unfortunately timed archaeological dig, evidence of past murders do come to light. They're murders that will never be explained because they are lost so far in history that there's nothing to explain them. They will remain historical riddles. That was in part the purpose of the book. However, crime writers, like all fiction writers, have a God complex. We are creators of our world, we are controllers of our characters, and we are omniscient. We know everything, so I know what happened with those murders in Llys and I couldn't resist revealing them in Long Shadows, which is 3 novellas explaining them all, going back to the 14th century. If I like delving into the past in order to find the causes of a crime, I'm also interested in the consequences, the long-term consequences. Now, of course, you can take this too far. Here's a good story, possibly like the Moat one, apocryphal, but it's too good to waste. In the 14th century, there we are again, the city-states of Italy were spreading their commercial wings across the Mediterranean and through into the Black Sea, and the Genoese had established a trading base in the Crimea, in what is now Feodosia. One day, some of the Genoese merchants left their base and wandered off into the city, where they got into a bit of a barney with some locals, in the course of which one of the locals was stabbed to death. What was the consequence of this murder? Well, you could say it was the death of half of Europe, the decline of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, the Reformation, the collapse of Christendom, and ultimately Hitler. Why? Because the immediate result of the murder was that the population of the city chased the merchants back to their base, where they holed up. A Mongol army came to besiege them, and when the soldiers started falling sick and dying, their bodies were catapulted into the compound, and the Genoese merchants started falling sick. They decided to give up and sail away out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean to one port after another in Italy. Each time they put into port, as soon as it was discovered that the ship was full of dead and dying, it was forced out to sea again. But too late. For the next 3 years, the Black Death swept through Europe, seeding economic chaos, social revolt, distrust of the failing church, and feeding an already ripe anti-Semitism, hence the long-term consequences. Am I being a bit extreme with that? Yes, but murders do have consequences. They don't just end with the capture of the murderer, or even with him being hanged by the neck until dead. They go on far longer. We can all picture the ideal Agatha Christie ending to a case. All interested parties are gathered in the drawing room. The great detective teases each of them before the great reveal. The murderer is identified. The bumbling policemen gratefully cart him off to prison. And pretty young Flora says, "Well, well, so it was my fortune-hunting fiancé who hacked my mother to death with an axe. I never suspected a thing, but not to worry, I've decided to marry the boring but very reliable doctor, and we're going to live happily ever after. Now, who's for tea and cakes?" And they all laugh. I don't think murder really has any closure like that. Nobody laughs. Lives are destroyed. Not just the life of the victim, but of the murderer, the family, the survivors. If your partner, your child, your parent was murdered, would you just get over it and move on? I very much doubt it. Even random witnesses and passers-by are going to be marked for life. In 1993, a host of witnesses saw the toddler Jamie Bulger being abused as he was dragged away by his murderers. Do you imagine that any of them will have forgotten that? It will be sealed on their memories forever. In A Time for Silence, Sarah is dealing with the long-term consequences of a murder that happened way before she was even born. In my novel The Unravelling, 6 middle-aged women are mentally scarred by a murder that happened when they were just 10. It was a murder that was never resolved in court, but they bear the scars still, and it's only the truth of what really happened that brings them any healing in the end. Not total healing, just some. If there's a closure of any form with murder that I would regard as a sort of justice, even of a very pale form, it isn't punishment, but the truth. Revelation of the truth, not to judge and jury, but to the people who really matter. That's what really interests me when I write about crime. That forms the basis of my crime fiction. Thank you for listening to me.